At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI slop. In the end, what's HFY without humanity? Subscribe to keep it this way. My name's General G. Let's begin. It was meant to be a veiled insult. When humanity first joined the galactic stage and entered the Confederation, it was expected that the older species would offer them a welcome gift, as tradition dictated. The problem was that the Virit people's first impression of humans had been poor. They considered them barely sapient and brutish. As a result, their gift was an uninhabitable planet with a solid radioactive core, no magnetic field, and an atmosphere long since stripped away by stellar winds. Now 100 years had passed, and the Virit High Council couldn't believe the news that humans had apparently dug a tunnel to the planet's core and built a city there. Ibit sat at the curved edge of the council table, his long fingers drumming nervously against the clean surface. The chamber was dimmed, all attention focused on the three-dimensional projection hovering above the table's center. The hologram showed a planet, their planet technically, the one they'd given to humanity as a cruel joke, and it was surrounded by an impossible amount of traffic. Ships, dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, tiny specks of light moving in organized patterns around what should have been a dead rock floating in space. Ibit's matte black skin seemed to absorb the cold light from the projection, making him look like a shadow given form. His lean body was tense, his elongated torso bent forward as he studied the display. The draped ears that hung from either side of his narrowed head swayed slightly as he tilted his head, the fluffy balls of white fur at their tips absorbing the light. He was young for a counselor, barely 2 centuries old, and moments like this reminded him why the elder members often dismissed his opinions. To his left sat Tazip, ancient and still. The elder counselor's skin had taken on a slight gray tinge with age, and his ear tips were more cream than white. He watched the projection with unblinking eyes, his expression unreadable. To Ibit's right, Lore shifted in his seat, his ears carelessly placed over his shoulders. Lore was middle-aged by Virit standards, his black skin still lustrous, his movements still quick and sharp. Of the three of them, he seemed the most disturbed by what they were seeing. The projection rotated slowly, showing different angles of planet EB-47, or New Mars, as the humans had apparently renamed it. The data stream scrolling beside the image showed atmospheric readings, energy signatures, electromagnetic fields that shouldn't exist, and most bizarrely, a classification that read, population 47 million and growing. 47 million. On a planet with no atmosphere, on a planet with a radioactive core, on a planet they'd given away specifically because it was worthless. Ibit felt his secondary stomach twist. They'd made a mistake. Somehow, impossibly, they'd made a terrible mistake. The silence in the chamber was oppressive. For nearly 10 minutes, none of them had spoken. They simply watched the projection, each lost in their own thoughts, their own disbelief. The data had arrived 3 cycles ago, and they'd been in this chamber ever since, verifying, cross-referencing, hoping to find some error in the intelligence. But there was no error. The humans had done something to that planet, something significant. "Is the data trustworthy?" Ibit finally asked, his voice breaking the silence like a stone through glass. His words came out softer than he'd intended, almost hesitant. Tazip didn't turn to look at him. The ancient counselor's eyes remained fixed on the swirling projection. "The data comes from 3 independent sources," he said. "Trade manifests, electromagnetic surveys from passing vessels, and direct observation from the Kelfier embassy ship. Yes, Ibit, the data is trustworthy." "But how?" Ibit leaned forward, his ears drooping with confusion. "That planet was dead. Worse than dead, it was actively hostile to life. The radiation alone—" "They've built something underground," Tazip interrupted. "According to the preliminary analysis, there are massive excavations. The data suggest They've tunneled deep into the crust. Perhaps they found shelter somewhere underground." Lore stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He began to pace, his movements sharp and aggressive. "This doesn't make sense. Economically, I mean, it doesn't make any sense at all." He gestured wildly at the projection, his hands cutting through the holographic light. "Look at the location of that system. It's 16 light-years from the nearest inhabited world, 100 from their homeworld. The logistics alone would be astronomical. Do you understand how much it would cost to establish a colony in such a remote location, on a dead planet?" Lore's voice rose with each sentence, his frustration evident. "They could have colonized 100 other worlds for a fraction of the cost. Worlds with atmospheres, worlds with water, worlds that aren't bathed in lethal radiation. Why would they choose that planet? Our gift?" He stopped pacing and turned to face the others, his ears rigid with anger. "I'll tell you why. Because they want to make us look bad. This is spite, pure and simple. They've built some token installation in that hellhole just to prove they could, just to embarrass us. Look what we did with your worthless gift, they're saying. Look how resourceful we are." "Perhaps," Ibit said carefully, "we should simply accept that they've found some use for the planet and move on. Why does it matter what they've built there? It was a gift. What they do with it is their concern, not ours." "Accept it?" Laura's voice cracked with disbelief. "Ibit, do you understand what this looks like? We gave them a dead planet as an insult, and now they're parading around with millions of inhabitants on it? They're making us look like fools." "Or," Tazip said quietly, his ancient voice cutting through Laura's anger, "they've found something valuable that we missed." The chamber fell silent again, that possibility poisoning the air like a toxic gas. Ibit felt his blood chill. "You think they discovered something? Some resource we didn't detect?" "It would explain the economic investment," Tazip replied. "No species commits that level of resources without expecting a return. Either they've found something worth extracting, or—" He paused, his fingers steepling together. "Or Lore is correct, and this is an elaborate gesture designed to humiliate us." "Either way," Lore said, resuming his pacing, "we need to know. We need to investigate. If they found valuable resources on a planet we gave away, that makes us look incompetent. If they're building there purely out of spite, that's valuable intelligence about human psychology and their attitude toward our species." "I disagree," Ibit said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Investigating would make us look petty. We gave them a gift, they used it. That should be the end of the matter." "The end of the matter?" Lore spun toward him. "Ibit, you're young. You don't understand politics the way Tazip and I do. Perception matters in the Confederation. If word spreads that we gave humanity a worthless planet and they turned it into a thriving colony, it makes us look short-sighted, weak. Other species will question our judgment." "And if word spreads that we're investigating their use of our gift," Ibit countered, "it makes us look petty and suspicious, like we're upset they succeeded with it." "He has a point," Tazip murmured, though his tone suggested he didn't fully agree. Lore slammed his hand on the table. "We need information. That's not petty, that's due diligence. I propose we send an observer, someone to visit this new Mars and document what the humans have actually built there. Nothing official, just an informal inspection." "An inspection of their planet?" Ibit's ears flattened against his head. "They'll see right through that." "Then we use a pretext," Tazip said. "A commercial inquiry, perhaps. We could claim interest in establishing trade relations with their new colony." "And who would we send?" Ibit asked, though he already knew the answer. He could feel it coming like a storm on the horizon. Lore and Tazip exchanged a glance. Then they both turned to look at him. "No," Ibit said immediately. "Absolutely not." "You're the logical choice," Tazip said. "You're young enough that it won't seem like an official high-level investigation. You can play the role of a curious junior counselor interested in trade opportunities." "I don't want to play any role," Ibit protested. "I think this entire idea is misguided. We should leave them alone." "Noted," Lore said curtly. "I call for a vote. All in favor of sending an observer to New Mars to document and report on the human colony there?" Tazip raised his hand. Lore raised his own. They both looked at Ibit. "Against," Ibit said firmly, keeping his hands on the table. 2-1, Lore announced. "The motion passes. Ibit, you'll depart within the week. Prepare your vessel and develop a suitable cover story." Ibit slumped in his chair, his ears drooping completely. Of course, they'd outvoted him. Of course, they'd volunteered him for this fool's errand. He was the youngest, the least influential, the most expendable if this diplomatic disaster blew up in their faces. Damn them both, he thought bitterly, as Tazip began outlining the parameters of his mission. Damn their curiosity and their wounded pride, and damn me for not being persuasive enough to talk them out of this idiocy. He was going to have to visit a planet full of humans, inspect their colony built in the core of a radioactive hellscape, and somehow make it seem like a casual trade inquiry rather than the spying mission it actually was. Wonderful, Ibit thought as the meeting finally adjourned. Just wonderful. The viewport of the swift traveler showed a growing sphere of reddish-brown rock, and Ibit felt his anxiety growing along with it. 3 weeks had passed since that disastrous council meeting, 3 weeks of preparation and travel, and now he was actually here, approaching the planet the humans called New Mars. He sat in the captain's seat, a term that felt grandiose for a ship this small, and studied the planet. The ship was a personal vessel, fast and elegant, suitable for a junior counselor on semi-official business. It had everything he needed: comfortable quarters, advanced sensors, and most importantly, enough speed to run away if this visit went catastrophically wrong. The planet itself looked exactly as the old surveys had described: barren, airless, and utterly hostile to life. The surface was a patchwork of browns and grays, ancient impact craters visible even from this distance. No blue oceans, no white clouds, no green patches of vegetation, just dead rock. And yet, the sensors told a different story. There was an atmosphere, thin, barely there, but present when the old surveys had shown vacuum. There was a magnetic field, weak but detectable, when there should have been none at all. And there was traffic, dozens of ships coming and going, flowing established flight paths like insects around a hive. Ibit had spent most of the journey trying to construct a plausible excuse for his visit. He'd considered dozens of options, each more elaborate than the last. He could claim to be conducting an academic survey of human colonization efforts. He could pretend to be a journalist writing a piece on unusual settlements. He could say he was a private entrepreneur looking for investment opportunities. None of them felt convincing. The truth was too obvious. He was here to spy, and anyone with half a brain would see through whatever story he concocted. In the end, he decided to keep it simple. He would claim that the Virit High Council was interested in establishing commercial relationships with this new human colony. It was bland, generic, and just plausible enough that they might not immediately kick him off the planet. Might not. He reached forward and activated the communication system. A woman's face appeared after a moment, human, with short-cropped hair. "This is New Mars Traffic Control," she said in a crisp galactic standard. "Please identify your vessel and state your business." Ibit swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. "This is Virit Vessel Swift Traveler, registry VR 1134. I am Counselor Ibit of the Virit High Council. I'm here on a commercial inquiry to explore potential trade relationships between our peoples and your colony." The woman's expression didn't change, but Ibit thought he detected a flicker of something in her eyes. Surprise? Suspicion? "Hold position," she said. "Your request is being reviewed." The screen went dark, leaving Ibit alone with his thoughts and his steadily increasing anxiety. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles darkening with pressure. This was a mistake. He should have refused more strongly. Should have made Lore or Tazip come instead. Should have... The screen flickered back on, but it was a different human this time. Male, older, with gray streaking his hair and a skeptical expression on his weathered face. "Counselor Ibit," the man said, his tone professionally neutral. I am Administrator Harrison, Director of External Relations for New Mars. I have to say, your request comes as something of a surprise. The Virit High Council hasn't shown any interest in this colony for 100 years. Why the sudden change? Ibit scrambled for a response. The Council reviews all Confederation settlements periodically. Your colony's growth metrics caught our attention, and we thought it prudent to establish formal diplomatic contact. Growth metrics, Administrator Harrison's expression suggested. He didn't believe a word of it. Counselor, let me be direct. Are you here to check up on us, to see what we've done with your gift? The bluntness caught Ibit off guard. That is, the Council is naturally curious about... Because if you're here to assess whether we've wasted your generous donation, Harrison continued, his voice taking on a slight edge, I'm not sure what you expect to accomplish. The planet is ours now. What we do with it is our business. Ibit felt heat rising in his face, a physical reaction the Virit rarely experienced. I assure you, Administrator, the Council's intentions are entirely peaceful and diplomatic. There was a long pause. Harrison seemed to be consulting with someone off-screen. Finally, he turned back to the camera. You want to know what we found here, don't you? Harrison said quietly. What valuable thing we discovered that made it worth colonizing this useless gift you gave us? Ibit opened his mouth to deny it, but the words died in his throat. The Administrator's eyes were sharp, knowing there was no point in lying. Yes, Ibit admitted. For the first time, Harrison smiled. It wasn't a friendly expression, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the smile of someone who just confirmed a long-held suspicion. Well then, Harrison said, I suppose you'd better come down and see for yourself. We've been wondering if you'd eventually show up. Clear you for landing at Spaceport Gamma. Transmitting coordinates now. Welcome to New Mars, Counselor Ibit. I think you're in for a surprise. The screen went dark again, and Ibit found himself staring at the navigation display, watching as the landing coordinates populated his system. They'd said yes. After his clumsy admission about the Council's curiosity, they actually granted him access. He didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified. The swift traveler began its descent, and Ibit found himself gripping the armrests again. The ship shuddered slightly as it hit the upper atmosphere, the atmosphere that shouldn't exist. His sensors showed it was thin, barely denser than high vacuum, but it was there. Nitrogen, oxygen, traces of argon, and carbon dioxide. The humans had put an atmosphere here. The descent was smooth, automated systems guiding him down toward the coordinates. The ship touched down quickly, and Ibit sat for a moment in the sudden silence. Through the viewport, he could see the barren surface of New Mars stretching away in all directions. It looked exactly like the survey images from 100 years ago, except for the spaceport and the roads and the massive elevator structure rising from the ground about a kilometer away, disappearing into a shaft that led down into the planet's crust. Movement caught his eye. A figure in a spacesuit was approaching his ship, waving in an exaggerated gesture that probably meant he should come outside. Ibit stared at the human for a long moment, then slowly rose from his chair. His suit was already on. Virit environmental suits were form-fitting, more like a second skin than the bulky affairs humans wore. He activated the helmet, feeling the familiar tingle as the field generator created an atmospheric bubble around his head. The airlock cycled, and Ibit stepped out onto the surface of New Mars. The gravity was lighter than he'd expected, maybe 0.6 standard. The spacesuit-clad human approached, still waving, and Ibit awkwardly waved back. The human's suit had a transparent faceplate, revealing a young man with an enthusiastic grin that seemed incongruous with their barren surroundings. The human tapped something on his wrist, and a voice crackled over Ibit's suit radio. Counselor Ibit! Hi, I'm Lucas, your guide for today. Welcome to New Mars. The enthusiasm was overwhelming. Thank you, Ibit said carefully. Oh, we've been expecting someone from Virit to show up eventually, Lucas said cheerfully, gesturing for Ibit to follow him. There were bets on when it would happen. I won, by the way. You were expecting us? Ibit asked, following the human across the landing pad. Sure. I mean, you give someone a worthless planet as a backhanded insult, and then 100 years later, you hear they've got a major colony there? Of course you're going to be curious about what they found. Lucas glanced back at him, his grin visible through the faceplate. Don't worry, we're not offended. Actually, we're kind of grateful, but we'll get to that. They reached a large structure at the end of the spaceport, the elevator shaft Ibit had seen from above. Up close, it was enormous, easily 50 meters across, with massive doors currently standing open. So, Lucas said, leading him inside, Administrator Harrison said you wanted to see what we've done with the place. I figure the best way to do that was to take you straight to the core. That's where most people live. The core? Ibit echoed. You mean the planet's core? The radioactive core? Yep. Lucas pressed a button on a control panel, and the massive doors began to close behind them. Don't worry, it's perfectly safe now. Well, mostly safe. You'll want to stay away from the unshielded sections, but the main city is completely protected. The doors sealed quickly, and Ibit found himself in a vast elevator chamber. It was easily large enough to accommodate cargo containers, small vehicles, even a small spacecraft. The walls were lined with seats and harnesses, suggesting this was designed to carry both freight and passengers. You might want to sit down and strap in, Lucas said, moving to one of the seats. The acceleration can be a bit intense if you're not used to it. Ibit moved to a nearby seat, his movements stiff. The seat wasn't designed for virid bodies, but he managed to secure the harness across his torso. His ears were pressed flat against his head, the fluffy tips trembling. Lucas settled into his own seat and tapped his wrist console. Core Control, this is Elevator 3. We have our VIP passenger secure, ready for descent. A voice crackled back. Copy, Elevator 3. We are ready to give our Virit guest a special ride. Beginning descent in 3, 2, 1. Special ride? Before he could understand the meaning of that statement, the floor dropped away. Ibit's stomach attempted to exit his body through his throat. The elevator plummeted downward with an acceleration that felt impossible. The walls of the shaft blurring past in the dim lighting. His hands clenched the armrests, his knuckles going pale, his ears plastered completely flat against his skull. First time's always intense, Lucas called over the rumble of the descent. His voice was cheerful, as if they weren't plummeting toward the radioactive center of a dead planet at terminal velocity. But the trip takes just 10 minutes. 10 minutes. 10 minutes of this acceleration. Ibis felt his secondary stomach heaving, bile rising in his throat. He clenched his jaw, determined not to vomit in front of this human, but the nausea was overwhelming. The deceleration is worse, I'm afraid, Lucas added, but the view at the bottom makes it all worth it. Ibit couldn't respond. He focused all his energy on not being sick, on breathing through the nausea, on surviving this insane descent into the bowels of a planet that should never have been colonized. After what felt like an eternity, Lucas spoke again. We're approaching the halfway point, starting deceleration in 3, 2, 1. The elevator's motion changed. Instead of falling, Ibit now felt like he was being crushed into his seat. The deceleration was even worse than the acceleration, pressing him down with what felt like triple gravity. He made a small, involuntary sound of distress, his vision graying at the edges. Almost there, Lucas said encouragingly. Just another minute. The elevator slowed, and finally came to a smooth stop. The harnesses released automatically, and Lucas stood up, perfectly steady on his feet. He looked over at Ibit, and his expression shifted from cheerful to concerned. Uh-oh, Counselor, are you okay? Ibit sat in his seat, hands still clenched on the armrests, his entire body trembling. He tried to speak, but only managed a weak croak. His stomach was still somewhere up near the surface, and his brain hadn't quite caught up with the fact that the motion had stopped. Take your time, Lucas said, moving closer. He pressed something on the wall, and a sealed container extended toward Ibit. If you need to, the bag is right here. Ibit stared at the motion sickness bag for a long moment, then reluctantly reached for it. His pride warred with his nausea, and nausea won. He barely got the bag to his face in time. After several minutes of deep breathing and absolute stillness, Ibit finally felt stable enough to attempt standing. His legs were shaky, but they held him. He carefully sealed the sickness bag and looked around for somewhere to dispose of it. "I'll take that," Lucas said, accepting the bag without any visible disgust. "Ready to see the core city, or do you need a few more minutes?" Ibit wanted to say he needed several hours, possibly days, to recover from that nightmare descent, but he'd come this far, and he wasn't about to show more weakness in front of this insufferably cheerful human. "I'm ready," he said, his voice only slightly unsteady. "Great." Lucas moved to the elevator doors and pressed a control. "Fair warning, what you're about to see is going to be disorienting. The core operates in near-zero gravity, so the physics are a bit strange. Try not to freak out." The doors opened, and Ibit's brain simply stopped working. He was looking out into a cavern so vast he couldn't see the far side. The chamber stretched away in every direction, curving gradually out of sight, easily tens of kilometers across, and filling that impossible space was a city. But not a city like anything Ibit had ever seen. There was no down here, no ground floor or foundations. Buildings floated in the void, connected by cables and bridges and tubes. Some structures were spherical, others cylindrical, a few shaped like elaborate fractals. Lights glowed from thousands of windows, creating a constellation of habitation in the darkness. And the people, the humans, were flying. Not with machines, but with their own bodies, jumping from building to building in the minimal gravity, soaring through the open space in graceful arcs. There were thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands, moving through their inverted city like a school of luminescent fish. "Welcome to the core," Lucas said softly. "Pretty cool, right?" Ibit couldn't speak. He stood in the doorway of the elevator, staring at the impossible city, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were showing him. This couldn't be real. This couldn't exist. They were in the core of a planet surrounded by radioactive material in zero gravity, and there was a city here with tens of thousands of inhabitants going about their daily lives as if this were perfectly normal. "I know it's a lot to take in," Lucas said, "but trust me, once you try moving forward in zero-G, you'll love it. Come on, I'll show you around." He stepped out of the elevator, bent his knees, and pushed off gently. He soared away from the platform, drifting toward the nearest building. Ibit remained in the doorway, his ears drooping completely, his hands gripping the frame. Lucas turned in midair, somehow reorienting himself, and called back, "First time is scary, but the gravity is so low, you can't really hurt yourself. Just push off gently and aim for that platform there." No, absolutely not. Ibit was not leaving the elevator. He would stand here until it was time to return to the surface, write his report from this spot, and never, ever venture into that impossible city floating in the void. But Lucas was watching him expectantly, and the human's enthusiasm was somehow infectious. Worse, Ibit's pride was reasserting itself. He was a counselor of the Virit High Council. He had traveled halfway across the galaxy to see this colony. He was not going to stand in the doorway like a frightened child. Taking a deep breath, Ibit carefully released his grip on the doorframe, bent his knees as he'd seen Lucas do, and pushed off. He immediately realized his mistake. He'd pushed too hard, much too hard. Instead of drifting gently toward the platform, he was rocketing across the void, spinning slightly, with no idea how to stop or change direction. "Whoa! You okay?" Lucas was suddenly beside him, having somehow intercepted his trajectory. The human caught him by the arm, gently arresting his momentum. "Yeah, that happens. Everyone overshoots their first jump. The trick is to push about a tenth as hard as you think you need to." They drifted together toward one of the larger structures, a spherical building covered in windows and what looked like gardens. As they approached, Ibit could see that the windows were actually open spaces, and people were moving freely in and out without any kind of airlock. "Wait," Ibit said, his scientific mind finally reasserting itself. "The atmosphere. How is there atmosphere in this chamber, and how are people breathing without suits?" "Oh, good question." Lucas guided them toward a landing platform that extended from the spherical building. "The whole core chamber is pressurized. We carved out this cavity over 40 years ago, and as we went, we installed atmosphere generators and processors. The air here is actually better quality than what you'd find on most colony worlds. Lower gravity means less strain on the circulation systems." They touched down on the platform, and Ibit found his footing. The gravity here was so low he barely weighed anything. He felt like a slight breeze could carry him away. The view from the platform was even more spectacular than from the elevator. He could see the full scope of the city now. Hundreds of major structures, thousands of smaller ones, all connected by an intricate web of cables, tubes, and bridges. Humans moved through the space in every direction, some jumping between buildings, others using small thruster packs for more precise maneuvering. "This is the main residential sector," Lucas explained, walking along the platform with tiny bouncing steps. "About 30 million people live in the core proper. The rest are spread throughout the mining levels and the surface installations." 30 million people, Ibit repeated numbly, living inside the core of a radioactive planet. "Well, it's not radioactive anymore," Lucas said. "Not seriously, anyway. That's actually the whole reason we've built here. Come on, I'll show you." He led Ibit across a bridge to another structure, this one more industrial in appearance. The walls were thicker, lined with what looked like heavy shielding, and there were fewer windows. Inside, the corridors were more conventional, with clear floors and ceilings, though the low gravity still made walking feel strange. They passed other humans, and each one greeted Lucas cheerfully. Most of them stared at Ibit with curiosity. Probably not many Virit visitors here, but no one seemed hostile, just curious. "We're heading to the reactor district," Lucas explained as they walked away. "That's where you'll really understand what we did here." They took another elevator, this one thankfully much slower and shorter, descending to a lower level. The doors opened onto a viewing platform overlooking a vast chamber filled with machinery. And in the center, glowing with a beautiful blue light, was the reactor. It was enormous, easily 1,000 meters tall, a cylinder wrapped in cooling systems and conduits. The glow came from Cherenkov radiation, visible through the transparent shielding. Around it, dozens of technicians in protective gear monitored systems and made adjustments. "This is the heart of New Mars," Lucas said, his voice taking on a reverent tone. "We mined out the radioactive materials from the core and used them to build this, a massive breeder reactor. It generates enough power to run the entire colony, plus quite a bit extra." "But why?" Ibit found himself asking. "Why go to all this trouble? The logistics alone must be staggering." Lucas smiled. "Let me show you something else." He led Ibit to another viewing platform, this one showing a different chamber. Inside, massive coils glowed with electromagnetic energy, creating an invisible field. "That's our magnetic field generator," Lucas explained. "The reactor powers it. We've created an artificial magnetic field for the entire planet. It's not as strong as a natural one yet, but it's enough to deflect most of the stellar wind. That's how we've been able to start building an atmosphere." Ibit stared at the generator, his scientific education finally catching up. "You're terraforming the planet. Slowly, but you're actually terraforming it." "Yep. The reactor produces heat as a byproduct, and we pipe that heat to the polar regions. There are vast deposits of frozen volatiles there. Water, ice, frozen carbon dioxide, nitrogen ice. We're slowly melting them, releasing gases into the atmosphere. It'll take a very long time before the atmosphere is thick enough to breathe without assistance, but we're getting there." "But why?" Ibit asked again. "This must cost... I can't even imagine the resources required. There are thousands of habitable planets in the Confederation. Why pour so much effort into terraforming a radioactive wasteland?" Lucas was quiet for a moment. Then he gestured for Ibit to follow him to a small observation lounge off the main platform. Through the windows, they could see back into the core city, the floating buildings and soaring humans visible in the distance. "Can I be honest with you?" Lucas asked. "Please." "When we first got this planet as a gift, everyone knew what it was, an insult. The Virit thought we were primitive, barely worthy of joining the Confederation. This planet was your way of saying, 'Here's your welcome present, you unsophisticated apes. Try not to kill yourselves with it.'" Ibit felt heat rising to his face again, but he didn't deny it. "And yeah, a lot of humans were angry about that," Lucas continued. "Some people wanted to reject the gift outright, give it back with a pointed message. But others," he smiled, "others saw an opportunity." "An opportunity?" "See, the thing about humans is that we're stubborn, spiteful even. Tell us something is impossible, and we'll do it just to prove you wrong. And this planet? This was the ultimate challenge. Lucas pointed toward the reactor chamber. The radioactive materials were valuable, really valuable. At the time, humanity was desperately short on heavy elements for our reactor programs. Mining this planet core gave us enough uranium and thorium to power our expansion for decades. So, that was the first reason, pure economics. And once you mined the core? Ibit asked. Well, we had this giant hole, and the gravity at the core was nearly zero because we'd removed so much mass. And some engineer said, you know what would be cool? Living here. And others said, that's insane. And the first engineer was right because here we are, and it is pretty cool. He gestured out at the floating city. And then someone said, if we're going to live in this core, we might as well terraform the surface. And everyone said that was even more insane, but we'd already done the impossible part. We'd already built a city in a radioactive hellscape. Compared to that, slowly building an atmosphere seemed almost reasonable. Lucas turned to face Ibit directly. So, to answer your question, why did we do this? Partly for spite, yeah. Partly because the resources were valuable. Partly because the challenge was there and we couldn't resist it. But mostly, he grinned, mostly because you told us we couldn't. Ibit was silent for a long time, processing everything he'd seen and heard. Finally, he asked the question that had been burning in his mind since the council meeting. Was it worth it? All of this effort? All of these resources just to prove a point to us? Prove a point? Lucas laughed. Counselor, we stopped thinking about the Viriat about 80 years ago. This stopped being about you almost immediately. Once we started building, once people started moving here, once children were born in the core and grew up jumping between buildings and zero gravity, this became our home. This became something we were doing for ourselves, not against you. He walked to the window, looking out at the city with obvious pride. 47 million people live here now. They're not thinking about some ancient insult. They're thinking about their jobs, their families, their lives. New Mars isn't a monument to human spite. It's just home. Ibit moved to stand beside him, his ears drooping thoughtfully. I came here expecting to find either a wasteland with a token settlement or evidence that you'd discovered something valuable we'd missed. And instead? Instead, I found that you actually valued our gift. Ibis felt something shifting in his understanding. We gave you this planet to mock you, to show you as primitive and incapable. And you took our mockery and built something extraordinary with it. That's one way to look at it, Lucas said. Another way is that you gave a bunch of stubborn, spiteful apes exactly the kind of challenge they needed to find their place in the Confederation. Without this planet, we might have settled on some easy world and become just another colony species. Instead, we built this. He swept his arm across the view of the core city. And now, when other species ask humans what we're capable of, we bring them here. Ibit's secondary stomach twisted again, but this time it wasn't from nausea. It was from the realization that he would have to return to the council and explain this. That the Virit's cruel joke had become humanity's triumph. That their attempt to humiliate the newcomers had instead given them the opportunity to prove themselves as one of the Confederation's most ambitious and capable species. I should return to the surface, Ibit said quietly. I have a long report to write. Sure thing, Lucas checked his wrist console. The next elevator up leaves in about 20 minutes. Fair warning, the return trip is just as rough as the descent. Wonderful, Ibit muttered. They made their way back through the city, Lucas pointing out various features and landmarks. Ibit tried to pay attention, tried to memorize details for his report, but his mind was elsewhere. He was already composing the message he'd have to send to Tazip and Lore, already imagining their reactions. We tried to ridicule them, and we ended up helping them, he thought as they reached the elevator platform. We gave them a worthless planet, and they turned it into a symbol of human ambition. Every time someone in the Confederation mentions New Mars, they'll remember that the Virit gave humanity this opportunity. The elevator doors opened, and Ibit reluctantly stepped inside, securing himself in the harness. Lucas waved from the platform. Safe travels, counselor. And hey, tell your council that if they want to establish trade relations, we're actually interested. We produce some unique materials here, and we're always looking for new markets. The doors closed, and Ibit felt the floor drop away as the elevator began its ascent. And as his stomach performed acrobatics that defied reason, he found himself experiencing something he'd never expected: respect for the humans, and shame for his own species' petty cruelty. The Virit had tried to teach humanity a lesson about their place in the Confederation. Instead, humanity had taught the Virit something far more valuable: that perceived worthlessness was often just a failure of imagination, and that the greatest gifts sometimes came disguised as insults.